Welcome to Create More Intimacy, a podcast for men. I'm Elisa Stoddard, and I help successful men stop chasing sex and start building real connection so they finally feel close, connected, and wanted again. You know you should listen better. You've probably been told this more than once. Maybe by her. Maybe by a therapist. Maybe you've told yourself after a conversation went sideways, but next time you'll do better. You'll stay calmer. You'll wait longer before responding. You'll really pay attention. So you try that. You sit still. You make eye contact. You don't interrupt. You nod. You wait for her to finish. And somehow it still doesn't land right. She still feels unheard. The conversation still ends with distance between you. You still walk away confused, wondering what you missed, because from where you're standing, you were listening. This is one of the most disorienting experiences men describe when they're trying to improve their relationship. They make a genuine effort. They apply what they think listening looks like. And the result is the same as before, or close enough to it that the difference doesn't seem to matter at all to her. What's happening here isn't that you aren't trying hard enough. It's that trying harder to listen and actually hearing someone are two different things. And most men were never shown the difference. Welcome to episode 61, Why Trying to Listen Harder Isn't the Same as Hearing Her. When men decide to listen better, they usually focus on behavior. They stop talking over her. They put the phone down. They hold eye contact. They wait before responding. These are real adjustments, and they take effort. They're also not what she's asking for when she says she doesn't feel heard. The behaviors of listening and the experience of being heard are not the same thing. Listening, as most men practice it, is a form of receiving information. You gather what's being said, you track the content, you wait for your turn to respond with something useful. This is how listening works in most professional contexts. You hear the problem, you formulate a response, you contribute. But in a marriage, that process often creates the opposite of what she needs. When you're listening to gather information, there's a subtle orientation underneath it. You're waiting to understand long enough to respond. You're tracking for the moment when you can offer a solution, a reframe, or at least signal that you've registered the issue. The whole posture is aimed at what comes next. She feels that orientation, even if she can't name it. It registers as a kind of distance, like you're on the other side of a window. You're watching what's happening, but you're not inside it with her. What she needs when she talks to you isn't an audience, it's a witness. Someone who enters the experience with her instead of observing it from a safe distance. Those are entirely different things to be for someone. And the difference between them doesn't show up in your behavior. It shows up in how she feels during the conversation. One of the most painful places men land when they're genuinely trying is realizing that the effort doesn't always translate to impact. You can work harder at something and still produce the same result because the problem isn't effort. It's direction. You are applying the effort to the visible layer of the problem when the actual problem is underneath it. Here's what the effort usually looks like. You try to stay calmer. You catch yourself before you get defensive. You make sure she finishes before you speak. These aren't small things, and they require real regulation, especially when the topic is charged or when you feel like what she's saying is critical. But underneath all of that effort is still a goal to get to the other side of the conversation without it going badly. When your orientation is to manage the outcome of the conversation, you're not fully present in it. You're managing it. And that management is subtle enough that you probably didn't notice it. but not subtle enough that she doesn't feel it. What registers to her isn't the behavior, it's the quality of your attention. Is he actually here, or is he managing this? Is he trying to understand me, or is he trying to get through this without it turning into a fight? Most men, when they hear this, feel a familiar frustration. What am I supposed to do differently? I'm already trying. That frustration makes sense, but it's pointing at something really important. The question isn't what to do differently. It's what to stop doing. Specifically, stop orienting the conversation around the outcome. When you're in a conversation with her and some part of you is tracking how it's going, whether things are staying calm, whether she seems satisfied, whether you've managed to avoid the blow-up, you're not fully in the conversation. You're running a parallel process, and that process comes across as a form of absence. When a woman says she doesn't feel heard, she's usually not talking about the content of the conversation. She's talking about something that happens in the space between the two of you when she's trying to express something real. What she's pointing to is hard to name because it's not a behavior. It's an experience, and that's partly why this conversation is so difficult to have directly. She knows she doesn't feel heard. She can't always tell you exactly what would feel different. And when you ask, or when you try to demonstrate that you were listening by recapping what she said, it often makes things worse. Because recapping what someone said is still not the same as being present with them. There's something that happens when a person feels genuinely heard. It's physical as much as it is emotional. Something in the body releases. The pace of talking changes. There's more space in the conversation. Not because it got silent, but because what's being said doesn't have to fight for room. The person speaking doesn't have to push harder to get through. Most women have experienced what it feels like to talk to someone who's fully there. Usually a close friend or sometimes a therapist, occasionally a stranger sitting next to you on a plane. They know what it feels like when someone isn't arranging their next response while they're still talking. When someone isn't waiting for you to finish so they can fix it. When she tells you she doesn't feel heard, she's telling you that what she's experiencing with you doesn't feel like that. And you're not doing something wrong exactly. But the quality of the attention she needs isn't something most men were ever taught to offer. There's something that needs to be said before naming what gets in the way, because without it, the list that follows can start to sound like a character inventory. Things wrong with you, patterns to fix, and that is not what this is. Most men who struggle with being fully present in conversations with their wife aren't simply underdeveloped listeners. They are men who have been in enough conversations that went poorly and that ended in a shutdown or criticism or that particular silence that feels like a door closing, that staying open started to feel genuinely dangerous. Not a dramatic dangerous, dangerous in the way that reaching for someone repeatedly and coming back empty-handed eventually teaches you to stop reaching. When sharing something real has led to feeling dismissed, when being honest has led to conflict, when trying to connect has been met with distance or irritation, a man learns to protect himself the only way available to him inside the relationship. He manages instead of inhabits. He monitors instead of feels. He stays slightly outside the conversation because being fully inside it has cost him too many times. This isn't weakness. It's an entirely rational adaptation to the dynamic that stopped feeling safe. The cost of it is that the protection which kept him from absorbing more hurt also keeps him from being present enough to actually hear her. And she experiences that absence as evidence that he doesn't care, which is almost never what's true. What's true is that he stopped being able to afford it. Both of them are protecting themselves from the same rupture. They're just doing it in ways that make the rupture worse. There are a few specific things that interrupt real hearing, and they're worth naming directly because they're common and they feel reasonable from the inside. The first is problem solving. Most men move toward a solution faster than they realize. The moment there's a clear enough picture of what the issue is, his mind starts generating a response. This happens without a decision to do it. It's almost like a reflex. And it means you stop fully taking in what she's saying the moment you think you understand the problem. What she's saying after that point often contains the most important information, the nuance, the part that would complicate the easy answer. But you're not absorbing it the same way anymore because you've shifted into response mode. You have what you need, except you don't. The second is self-protection. When what she's saying touches something uncomfortable, a concern about the marriage or criticism of how you've been showing up, a need you haven't met, there's an almost automatic movement toward self-defense. You don't necessarily interrupt her or argue, but something in you closes slightly. You begin to track whether what she's saying is fair, whether you're being painted as the problem, whether you'll need to correct the record when she's done. That tracking is a form of leaving the conversation. You're no longer inside what she's sharing. You're building a case from the outside. The third is reassurance seeking. Some men, especially in high conflict or high distance relationships, are monitoring how the conversation is landing for a different reason. They want to know if they're okay, if she is still angry, if this is going somewhere manageable. The attention is on her response as feedback about the relationship's status, not on what she's actually communicating. All three of these are understandable for sure. None of them point to character flaws necessarily. They're the predictable result of being in a relationship that has felt unsafe or disappointing for a while. And when connection hasn't been reliable, you protect yourself. That's what people do. But the protection gets in the way of exactly what you are trying to create. Hearing someone, in the sense that creates the experience of being understood, requires a specific kind of presence. It's not passive and it's not silent. It's active in a way that most men haven't been shown how to practice. The first thing it requires is following her, not the argument. When she's talking, there are two things happening. There's the content of what she's saying, and there's the emotional current underneath it. Most men track the content and miss the current. She says something about feeling alone, and you hear it as a complaint. She says she doesn't feel like a priority, and you hear an accusation. What's underneath both of those is something more vulnerable and more specific. There's a feeling that has a shape, and until you are following the feeling rather than cataloging the content, you're one step behind what she actually needs you to understand. Following the feeling doesn't mean guessing or interpreting. It means staying curious about what this is like for her before you decide what it means. That's a different orientation than most men bring into difficult conversations. The second thing is that it requires tolerating incompleteness. One of the signals that a man has shifted into problem-solving mode is that he needs the picture to be complete enough to act on. He needs to understand the problem well enough to address it. And when he gets there, he moves. Real hearing often means sitting with something that isn't resolved. She may not need you to fix it. She may not even know what she needs from you yet. And being able to stay present with that without rushing towards resolution is one of the most useful things you can ever offer. The third thing it requires is checking instead of concluding. When you think you understand what she's saying, there is a reflex to respond based on that understanding. What shifts the experience for her is a moment where you make sure, not to demonstrate that you listened. We're not talking about active listening or reflective listening here, but because you genuinely want to know if you got it right. That moment of checking in, of treating your understanding as provisional rather than complete, signals something really important. It tells her you're still trying to get to where she is, rather than having already arrived somewhere nearby and inviting her to join you over there, even when it's not right. Most men underestimate what becomes possible when this shifts. The conversations don't necessarily get easier in the sense of being more comfortable, but they get somewhere. There's movement instead of the same old loop. She says more. She goes deeper. What was defensive or surface level starts to have more texture. And this happens because being heard changes what feels safe to say. When a person feels genuinely received, they stop having to push the same point harder. They stop having to escalate in order to feel met. There's less repetition, less circling, less of the conversations that feel like they're going everywhere and nowhere all at the same time. Men often describe this shift as the moment their wife started actually talking to them again. And it's not about logistics, not about the kids or the schedule or the next thing that needs handling, but talking, real talking, the kind that has weight and takes trust and goes somewhere. That doesn't come from trying harder to listen. It comes from listening in a way that lands. And the other thing that changes is internal. When you stop managing conversations and start actually being inside of them, something settles. You're not carrying the parallel process of tracking outcomes and protecting yourself. You're just there. And that's less exhausting than it might sound, because most of the energy you spend now goes into the management, not into connection. Connection, when it's real, doesn't require that kind of effort. If this feels uncomfortable, that's probably a good sign. Not because we're pointing out what you're doing wrong, but because most of what passes for listening in a marriage under strain is actually a sophisticated form of managing. You are working hard to get through the conversation and to keep it from escalating and to stay regulated enough that you don't make things worse. That isn't laziness. It's a learned response to years of conversation that haven't gone the way you'd hoped. But management is tiring. But management isn't presence, and she can feel the difference. A question we're sitting with. The last time she told you that she didn't feel heard, what were you actually tracking during the conversation? Were you following what she was feeling? Or were you watching how the conversation was going? You don't have to answer that out loud, but being honest about it with yourself is where this kind of change actually starts. And if you're at the point where you're ready to stop figuring this out alone, there's a relationship clarity call that you can book at elisastoddard.com. It's 30 minutes, and we'll look at what's actually happening in your specific situation and what's getting in the way and what you need to shift for things to genuinely feel different. You'll leave that conversation knowing more than when you came in, whether we decide to work together or not. Again, you can book that at elisastoddard.com. Now, before we go, I want to invite you to a webinar, What She Stopped Saying, which will be on July 8th at 11:30 a.m. Pacific, 12:30 p.m. Mountain, 1:30 p.m. Central, and 2:30 p.m. Eastern. And you can register for that using the link in the bio, also at elisastoddard.com in the upper right-hand corner. Take care. We'll see you next time. Thanks for being here. If something in this episode hit home, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. It helps more men find the support they need. And if you are ready to get help or take the next step, you'll find the link to book a free call in the show notes. I'll see you next time.